Hello, class, and welcome to Multicultural Ministry, Session 5. And the topic for this week is Church Models of Inclusion. So I hope things are going well with you. Your posts have been great, and I look forward to looking at your posts this week. Well, this lesson is about churches and how inclusive they are and the approach they take to become more inclusive. And so we're going to talk about 4 different models of inclusiveness this week. Churches tend to change, however, they tend to change at a slower pace than the rest of society. So for instance, if society is changing in terms of its technology, pop culture, music styles, churches will change pretty much at the same pace. But there are some other areas that take a bit longer for churches to keep pace with society at large. One of those difficulties churches have is with social shifts from monocultural communities to intercultural communities or multicultural communities. So cross-cultural engagement for society at large is the new norm in social settings outside of the church, but it becomes a sticky point for churches. Churches tend to move slowly when it comes to social engagement. So when ethnic change is slower in churches, those particular churches appear to be less relevant than churches that are willing to include other people. To visit a monocultural church as an outsider, perhaps not a member of the dominant culture in that church, a person may feel somewhat of an outcast, particularly if the community has changed, yet the church has not. So this would require us as a church to reorganize our approach and to think about what we can do in search for better understanding, to become a learning community, to try and discover how we can better impact our community. You know, we ask questions like, why don't we reflect our immediate community? What are the specific reasons why we fail to represent the immediate community? How can we break our allegiance to some of the models that we've held on to, perhaps if they were monocultural models or whatever the approach may be? How can we break our allegiance to those old models and find ways to better appreciate differences? We have to ask ourselves those kinds of questions if we want to move forward. So in an attempt to be more inclusive, some churches will do a number of things to embrace others into their space. One of the things churches will do will be to rent their space in church or share church space with other congregations. They'll rent their space to new churches or smaller churches in search of space, so that they can make room for others, or they will share their sanctuary with others. In these types of models, which would be like friendship or partnership models, and we'll talk about the difference later, this is where these pre-existing congregations come together. And sometimes that is as far as some churches will go when it comes to cross-cultural engagement or interculturalism. Perhaps they'll see the need to start up a new language-specific congregation based on someone within their congregation that speaks a language and that is feeling somewhat, missional in some ways, and they want to make space for a different language. Sometimes they will allow for a person to start up a congregation within their church, and oftentimes they'll take up space that the dominant church is not using, perhaps a fellowship room or a chapel somewhere within the church. Oftentimes these models will fail to blend people because they are not natural. People are still segregated, and the way that groups tend to blend in the society at large will not happen in these kinds of situations in churches. Um, so how do we decide the use of space when multiple congregations converge? Those are the kinds of questions I want us to think about. Should space be separated at all? Should congregations be separated? Do we divide time, divide rooms and spaces? How do we decide on who to put where? If a church that we're sharing space with is larger than the congregation of the dominant church or the host church, do they still take the fellowship room and the later church start time? These are the kinds of questions that churches will have to try and work through as they find ways to blend churches in the friendship model or the partnership model. So this week we'll be looking at two models in particular. We'll be looking at the monocultural model and the friendship model. We'll look at what those are. I'll try and offer a description of each approach, an outline of the benefits and the challenges, and then as we go on, I'll discuss some other issues with distribution of power and how power tends to be distributed in each of these models, how conflict is resolved, and how decisions are made. Finally, I'll try and address diversity and the gospel, and what I mean by that is how a particular model may influence interculturality and the lessons we can learn from others as we rub one against one another, various cultures together in a single space. That could be a great learning model for us as we spend time together with others. Which leads me to our form discussion for this week, Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So the question is this true that life is affected by rubbing against one another? If so, how can you become a more effective media for cross-cultural ministry, if it's true? I would like for you to give an example from Scripture and also an example from life. So if you have any questions, challenges, please feel free to call me this week. I'll be looking forward to speaking to you. God bless.